It's a subject we'll all deal with eventually, but don't like to talk about. Coming up next on Being Well, we'll be talking about the details of death. Our guests are Ed Pierce from Pierce Funeral Home in Marshall and Jeff Pierce, Clark County Coroner. Ed and Jeff will be here to address a variety of questions about funerals, cremation, prearrangement, and more. Stay with us. Being Well starts now. Well, I'm so pleased that Ed and Jeff Pierce from Marshall have come on Being Well today. We're going to talk about a subject that, as I said in the intro, everybody will deal with, but people don't like to talk about death and what happens after death. So, Ed, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the business that you're in.
Okay, I'm one of the very few whose family was not connected in funeral service at all. And my parents were very good friends of people who had a funeral home. And I started working there when I was 15 years old, cutting the grass, washing cars, and doing different things such as that. I became more interested in funeral service, and I have found it to be a very, very rewarding career. I attended Southern Illinois University, where I received my degree in mortuary science. Following that, I went and worked in the Chicago area, then the Peoria area, and then the Flora, Illinois area. And then I had the opportunity to buy the funeral home in Marshall, my hometown. It's been very, very good to me, and I truly love my profession. And I can't think of anything else that I'd want to do. I love being around the people. I love being of assistance to people when they've had a death. And I've just made a tremendous amount of friendships over the years by this. And like I say, the idea of retiring scares me to death. Okay.
And Jeff, you are, we've got a father and son team here.
Yeah.
You are the Clark County Coroner. Did you work in the funeral business with your dad?
Yes, yeah, I actually sort of started out like that, about 15 years old, washing cars, cutting grass, and started helping with funerals when I was about 16. When I first went away to college, I went and actually got an automotive degree, but while I was at college, over Christmas breaks and summers, I was working at the Vault Company in Marshall, and then I decided to go to mortuary school and worked at the funeral home, and then I worked in the Indianapolis area and down in Metropolis, Illinois, and worked a little bit over by St. Louis, and then came home and have been home close to 14 years now.
Okay. So we're going to get into lots of questions that, people are curious about, but they just don't know how to ask. And let's start first. If someone passes away in a home, or that you suspect they've died in the home, what do you do and who do you call?
Usually the first thing people do is they'll dial 911, and the dispatchers will send an ambulance and police to the house. And then if there's anything that can be done for the person, obviously they carry on from there with what they can do. And then if they decide there's nothing that they're able to do for the person, then they call for the coroner. The coroner will come out to the house, make the pronouncement of death, and decide what needs to be done from there, because the coroner's role is actually more of almost like a police investigator.
Okay.
And we can go and get the person's medical history. We authorize autopsies. That's one big misconception. A lot of people think that the coroners do autopsies. Well, we don't.
Okay. Who does them?
The person who does the autopsies are certified forensic pathologists.
Okay.
And we authorize them. We'll arrange for transportation to the autopsy. We'll get the results from the pathologist. We'll get information from the scene. We'll collect their medical history, and then we put everything together and determine the cause and manner of death.
Okay. And can anyone ask for an autopsy, or how do you determine if you should have an autopsy?
A lot of times the coroners will determine whether there'll be an autopsy or not, and we do that based on what we find at the scene and the circumstances surrounding the death. If we don't feel that one is warranted, and we can pretty well determine what the cause and manner of death is, a lot of times we won't have an autopsy performed. But the family still does have an option of asking for an autopsy, and the coroners will help them set up to have an autopsy performed. Although at that time, if the family wants one, it's at the family's expense.
Okay. So what does that mean on a death certificate then when you see it says cause of death, natural causes?
That could be anything from heart attack, cancer, normal pathology of diseases that they've occurred and have been documented. And
Okay.
yeah, or if we've gone through an autopsy and we find out that the person's had a heart attack or a stroke, then it's determined that it would be a natural cause.
So that's a common thing on a lot of death certificates is natural
yes.
causes. So what
Yeah.
what are some other, when you see a death certificate other than natural causes, what would be some other things that are put on there?
Well, see, there's the manner of death, and then there's the cause of death, which are two
Okay.
different things. Now, cause of death could be something like blunt force trauma to the head due to a motor vehicle accident. Well, then that would be the cause of death, but then the manner of death would be accidental.
Okay.
Unless, if you had somebody that ran them off the road intentionally, well then, instead of accidental, it becomes a homicide. I've also had car accidents where we have found the blunt force trauma, and it could have been accidental, but then during the autopsy we found out that the person had a heart attack, and the wreck was a result of the person having the heart attack. So then the cause of death was heart attack and natural, whereas if they would have died of injuries sustained in the accident, then they would have had an accidental death.
Okay. So the coroner comes into play after the person has passed away, even if they pass away in a hospital or a nursing home. What's the next step in the process after the coroner has, I assume you
yeah.
come and take the body to
Yeah,
wherever it
we,
needs to go.
I make the removals as the coroner, and then if it's a person that's had several heart attacks and stents and all that, and we know it's going to be a natural death, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just talk with the family, decide what funeral home they want to use, and then we'll release that body directly to the funeral home. If in my county, if I decide that we're going to have an autopsy, or an autopsy needs to be performed, then I arrange for the autopsy, transport the person to have the autopsy done, and then release the person after the autopsy's performed to whatever funeral home that the family chooses.
Okay, so Ed, we'll bring you into the conversation next. People come to, let's talk about people if the death is really immediate and they didn't have any pre-planning. What are some of the things that you're going to go through with that family?
Okay. We're going to need to set up an appointment with the family to meet with them as far as getting all the vital information for the death certificate and also for an obituary. We're going to discuss with the family on what type of services they want. We're going to need to talk with the family on the mode of disposition that they desire, such as either burial or cremation. We'll also meet with, when we're meeting with the family, we'll discuss with them the type of service that they want as far as, or I should say the type of memorialization, as far as the clergyman that they'll want, or what type of speakers that they'll want for the funeral service, and all different aspects of the funeral service itself. So none of them are totally the same. There's not a standard form that we use, because each family has different needs.
And when you think about it, people are making these decisions at a time of under great duress, and you only have one opportunity to make these decisions. How do you help people walk through that and make the right choices so that, the funeral and the services are, what they wanted for their loved one?
After you've been doing this for so long, you can, when you're meeting with a family, you can get a pretty good drift of what they're wanting and what they're needing. You need to give them all their various options that they have. So you might have a family come to you and say, that we want cremation. Well, then you'll need to when you're meeting with them, you'll need to talk with them. What do you mean by cremation?
Okay.
Do you want to have a service beforehand, or do you want to have a memorial service after the cremation? And you have to give them those options and then explain to them more about those options that they have. For example, if a family if they're desiring to have cremation, they can still go ahead and have a visitation before, they can have a funeral service, and then have the cremation following that with committal of the ashes later.
Okay.
Some families desire just to have direct cremation, and then they can go through, if they wish, they can have memorial service and burial the cremains later.
So I have a question. If you have a visitation with a body there that's going to be cremated, do you buy the casket? How do you deal with that? Because you're not going to bury it.
There's different ways that you can do that. What we do, we have what we call a rental casket. And it's an oak casket, and the cremation container is inside of the casket. But before a person can be cremated, or when they're taken to the crematory, they have to be in some type of container. So the rental casket that we use, the end drops down, and the cremation container is on the inside. It has an interior just like a normal casket would have, and then we just slide the cremation container out, and that is what is cremated.
Okay.
Some families we have had, they prefer not to use the rental casket. They would rather purchase a casket, and there are various types of cremation caskets that are available.
So what do you do if your loved one passes away in another state and the funeral is going to be held here in Charleston or Mattoon or Marshall?
Okay.
How do you deal with that?
The one thing that people should do is that, let's say if I lost a family member and they were in New York, the family would want to call their local funeral home first.
Okay.
And let us handle, or whatever funeral home they're going to be using, handle all of the arrangements. What we would do in that case is that we would contact a funeral home or a trade service that we call them in the New York area. We would have them to make the removal, do the preparation, and then make arrangements to have the remains sent to us via airline. That's an interesting question right now. We had a relative passed away Friday out in West Virginia, and they're going to have a service there this evening, and we're to have a graveside service in Marshall tomorrow. A lot of people do not realize you can do this. Her son had always promised his mom that he'd take her back to Marshall. He has a van. After they have the service, they're going to place the casket in the van, and he's going to drive straight through from West Virginia tonight.
So you
and
don't
be at our place about 5 or 6 o'clock tomorrow morning.
So do you have to have permits or something to transport a body across state lines?
What they will have to do is that they'll have to have a burial permit and a transportation permit. It's all one in the same.
Okay.
And then also he is going to have to sign a release and give to the funeral home out there, stating that they are not responsible for anything that happens. So if he's in an accident or something such as that on the way here.
So is the same paperwork involved if your loved one passes away here but is going to be buried in another state?
Basically the same.
Okay.
The only time you get into a problem is that if you go ahead and you contact another funeral home there,
Okay.
and then you're going to have to go through all that with them, and then you'd have to go through all of it with us. So you're better off just to call your local funeral home and let them take care of everything.
And they really do. I mean, that's your job, is to help the family
Yes.
make all these arrangements
Yeah.
and make that happen. Well, let's talk about ashes, because are more and more people being cremated now than maybe 20 years ago? Maybe I should rephrase the question. How has funerals and death changed in the last 20 years?
Okay. There's definitely more cremation now than what there was before. Most people, when they have a cremation, they will go ahead and have a service beforehand and then have a cremation following the service. Sometimes they'll keep the cremains for themselves, or they'll have interment in a cemetery.
Right.
And that's what most people do. The biggest change that I've noticed in funeral service in the last 40 years is the personalization that has come about. Used to be you just call the local minister, he'd get up and say a few words and that type of thing. But people are getting a lot more involved in funeral services for their loved one. We'll have more family members get up and speak and make it a lot more personal. And that's really been a very, very good thing. And people just feel better about the funeral service afterwards.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cremation. You get ashes, the remains. Can you do whatever you want with them? Can you spread them around? Jeff, I'll ask you that question. Are there laws that say what you can do with those ashes if you choose not to bury them?
Yeah, there are laws that do pertain to scattering of ashes, and a lot of them are municipal laws, and they vary from city to city and state to state. And there are a few federal laws on scattering of ashes and burial of ashes, but most of those pertain to burial at sea. But they also pertain to not only ashes, but full bodies also. The burial at sea laws do. But the scattering of ashes are more municipal, and then cemetery-wise, cemeteries will have restrictions on, some have what they call scattering gardens.
Okay.
Certain designated areas to scatter ashes. You can't just go out and, well, Uncle John wanted to be with his mom and dad, and late at night go out and just scatter the ashes over his mom and dad's grave. You can get in some trouble for that.
Yeah, so you can't do whatever
Yeah,
you
you
want.
can't just do whatever you wish.
So let's talk about, if you're not going to be cremated, let's talk a little bit about if you're going to have a traditional funeral and embalming and all of that sort of stuff. What are some things that the family should know about? I mean, you get to pick out clothing and things to wear, but it's a process, and we don't have enough time to get into the actual whole process of it. But what do you think people need to know about that process?
I think that people need to really sit down and they need to discuss these things previously with family members. One thing that I've noticed a lot of times is that a family will come in and make arrangements, and they will say, well, we promised mom or dad we would do this or do that. And they feel very, very uncomfortable about it. It's not what they really want to do. So I think that people need to sit down and discuss this. When people make pre-arrangements, they also need to take in consideration of what is going to be good for their family.
Right.
Because the family is the one that's going to have to live with it. Just as an example, I had a man come to me a couple of years ago wanting to make pre-arrangements for himself. And at the time of his death, he wanted us to make the removal, have burial, and then contact his family after that.
Really?
Because he was upset with his kids.
Okay.
And I guess legally you can do that if you have it stipulated in a will. I didn't feel comfortable in doing that because I didn't think it was the right thing for his family. So he didn't know what to do, so I said the best thing you could probably do is find another funeral home to do it for you, because we're not going to do it, you know. And I think a lot of times people come up with unreasonable requests and they really don't think about it. And they need to also consider what's going to be good for their family.
Okay. So if you have a traditional funeral, there's a certain amount of time it takes to prepare a body, whereas if there's cremation, you have some amount of time, but you could have a service a little bit later. What's the timeline if you're going to have the traditional funeral with the body? When can the actual funeral take place between when someone dies and when you can have that funeral?
Okay. It can be several days or weeks.
Okay.
You know, with embalming. We have a situation right now where we're going to have a service and the lady's been gone for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. We've done it where we did a couple years ago where we had embalming, and we waited, I believe it was 4 months before we had the service. The family decided not to view. I mean, and the lady looked fine. So there is a time. You're not cut down to just specific time. But what happens is, let's say if you want to have the service like 3 weeks later, you can do that. But that is a tremendous strain on the family.
Yeah.
To have to sit there and wait that whole time. And it's really unfair to a lot of family members, I feel.
So
you know.
this might be a strange question, but how long does an embalmed body, I don't want to say last, but how long does it last?
Okay, a remains after they're embalmed will last, I can't give you a specific time, but will last for a long time. But also, that depends on the manner of death.
Right.
A lot of times, if a person would pass away and there was a lot of trauma, or the condition of their remains was horrible at the time of death, they're not going to last as long as what somebody who would have died from a normal death.
Okay. Let's talk, you touched a little bit upon pre-planning funerals. What are some common mistakes people make when pre-planning a funeral?
The biggest mistake I believe that they make is that they will go to the funeral home or meet with a funeral director, and they request all these things, and they do not consider the feelings of their family. I think that this needs to be more of a family matter, and sit down and discuss these matters and see what's going to be to work out best for the family. I also think, and this might be ironic that I'm saying this, but I think a lot of times people make the mistake of price shopping, because you need to weigh the balance of what you're getting. Sometimes the least expensive is not always the best. Sometimes it can be just as good also. So you need to talk with people who have had experience with a funeral home and see what their experience has been with that particular funeral home.
So what advice would you give to people if they're watching now? You know, how should you, maybe if your family member or your spouse doesn't like talking about death, but you want to have that conversation about, well, what would you like? How do you even, what would you suggest, some of the basics that people should at least maybe talk about so everyone's kind of on the same page?
I would suggest that they decide on the type of disposition that they want, whether they want burial or cremation. They need to talk a little bit about the type of service that they want. And whether they want to or not, they need to sit down and try to discuss it with their family to see what's going to be the best. And then also, it's a good idea to always go and talk with a funeral director and find out what all your options are.
So how do you, I mean, you deal with people who are under these, stressful conditions, very sad time in their life. Why is it that people don't want to talk about death?
Because they're scared of it, and they do not like the idea of passing away, and they do not want to face the fact that it's going to happen eventually.
And it will happen to everybody eventually. Well, are there any last things that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up? We have just a couple of minutes. No? All right. Well, thank you for coming. Or Ed, did you have something?
Yeah, I just want to mention I really appreciate having the opportunity to come here today. I would also like to mention that I know of a lot of funeral directors, and as far as I'm concerned, most of the people in this area I consider as friends, and I think most of them, if not almost all, are very, very professional people, and I think they really look out what's going to be the best for their families that they're serving, because they're wanting to be there for years.
Sure.
And you cannot go and really take advantage of people and expect to be there for years. And most businesses go on from generation to generation. And like I say, in this profession, the vast majority are very, very good people. But you're always going to have some of those that you're going to hear about.
And we do hear about that.
And
in
you need to
news.
check that out with people.
Right.
And unfortunately, those are the ones that make the news all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we thank you, Ed and Jeff, for coming on the show and talking about this topic. And maybe if it gets people in their own family just to have even a short conversation, we think that that's a good thing, because you never know when death may happen, and that little bit of preparation can make it a little bit easier for those that are left behind. Thank you so much for coming on Being Well
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this episode of Being Well. Join us online anytime at youtube.com/WEIUTV. Here you can view current as well as past episodes. Just look for the Being Well playlist and select the program you'd like to watch. We'll see you next time.